Croeso I Blas Nanteos, a magnificent Palladian mansion about 3 miles from Aberystwyth on the West Wales coast. In many ways, the survival of this Georgian mansion is a miracle. So many 18th century gentry houses like Havard and Peterwell have been razed to the ground. But at Nanteos, here in this Grade 1 listed Rococo music room, we can come close to life as it really was for the Powell family who built this beautiful house, and which is now a luxurious country house hotel. In so many ways, the history of this family who lived here up until the 1950s is the story of all the great gentry families of Wales. Traceable to the nobles of medieval Wales, the Ap Howells, as they originally were, rose by holding minor civil and crown offices, making judicious and lucrative marriages, investing wisely in shares, land and mining, but most of all by mastering the legal profession and forging important alliances through marriage and patronage. In its heyday, the Nanteos estate held thousands of miles of land and property, not only in Cardiganshire, but in other parts of Wales and also in England. Despite the fact that Cardiganshire roads were atrocious and London 3 to 4 days' travel away, the Welsh Squires were also involved in the capital, holding property there and important office. By 1687, the Powell family had arrived. After an illustrious career in the law, Sergeant at Law, Judge on the North Wales Circuit and Baron of the Exchequer, Thomas Powell was knighted. From then on, the Powell heirs didn't have to work, but lived off the income of this estate. Thomas's son William married a local heiress, but it was time to be more ambitious. For his own eldest son, also a Thomas, William Powell looked to secure an English marriage. This he did in the person of Mary Frederick, who was extremely well connected and whose family was fabulously wealthy by Cardiganshire standards. Mary's brother was Sir John Frederick and her sister was the Duchess of Atholl. It was Mary's money that Thomas Powell used to build his fabulous new house. But it was not enough just to have wealth and a handsome house. Now the family were looking for major political office and to vie with the big boys, the Prices, the Vaughans, the Lloyds, to be MPs. Then, as now some might say, but let's not dwell on that subject, politics was rife with corruption. Favours and deals were forged, bribery and blackmail was everywhere, and armed factions intimidated would-be voters. After a tortuous battle, Thomas Powell realised the family's ambition to become an MP. But, like many minor gentry families, keeping up appearances and maintaining a flashy standard of living wasn't easy in the 18th century. The 1750s was the time of the notorious Cardiganshire Lead Wars, in which representatives for the Crown, Lewis Morris being the most important, fought local landowners to establish the rights to land on which rich seams of ore and sometimes even silver had been found. The so-called wastes, or upland commons, were literally being fought over, with Thomas and later his brother, the Reverend William Powell, being involved in lengthy and costly legal battles against the Crown to prove their rights to the mines. Despite being magistrates, both William and his henchman, the so-called wicked squire, Sir Herbert Lloyd of Peterwell, formed a gang and attacked Lewis Morris, capturing him at gunpoint and throwing him in Cardiganshire jail. As a result of this, they were both temporarily robbed of office, and a band of Scots Grey Guards had to be stationed in the hills in order to guard the king's mining interests. No wonder Cardiganshire in the 18th century was named the Wild West of Wales. Yet, despite the fact that Morris found dozens of witnesses, many of them monoglot Welsh speakers, to testify against the gentry interest, even bringing them to court in London, both Herbert Lloyd and William Powell were soon reinstated as JPs and their business interests once more made secure. So all-pervading was the stranglehold that these families had on the county that they seemed invincible. As Lord of the Manor, for instance, Herbert Lloyd appointed individuals to the court leet that ran the town. He collected payments due through births, marriages or deaths. Stray animals belonged to him, as did the fines incurred by their owners when they were reclaimed. He was landlord, JP, involved with sentencing, something he clearly relished. He was head juror, appointing jurors to the trials of individuals whose forfeited land he then bought at a knockdown price. He was involved in all manner of civil and legal appointments and became an MP, and even bought a knighthood from George III. His early legal training, such as it was, ensured that he became almost intouchable. Sitting MPs were protected from prosecution, but despite this, Herbert Lloyd was so hated that he travelled in his gilded coach to London or Bath, surrounded by heavily armed and liveried guards. When at home in Lampeter, he employed a gang of pikemen to ensure that elections and other decisions went his way. But what about the ordinary people? A Werin-Bobble, whose lives the likes of Herbert Lloyd controlled. So we've been upstairs to the music room, and here we are downstairs in the famous Nanteos kitchens. And what of the ordinary people, a Werin-Bobble, whose lives the likes of Herbert Lloyd controlled? For the most part, these lives seem to be cold, wet and brief. Unlike the gentry who've left behind them archives of letters, diaries, journals, it is rare for us to come across the authentic voices of people who are largely illiterate, monoglot Welsh speakers. We learn about their lives through tenancy agreements and employment documents, through parish vestry books as they received a meagre poor relief from their betters, through the diaries, letters and accounts of those betters. Most tantalising of all, we sometimes hear their direct speech recorded in court records in which they are giving evidence, sometimes at their own trials. The gentry, owning the land, their dwellings, the factors of production, and controlling all aspects of the legal system and civil administration, in a sense, owned the people themselves at this period. Whereas in medieval times, the great so-called noble houses had had a tradition of paternal care over their tenants, in the mid-18th century, management of the great estates was moving towards the use of professional stewards and land agents. These men were often monoglot English speakers from outside the area who had little sympathy with the tenants' inability to pay their rent. From this period, major landlords were increasingly anglicised themselves and often absent for much of the year at their residences elsewhere. So the traditional recourse to the better nature of their squire became impossible for the common people. Increasingly during this period, the enclosure movement allowed landowners to buy or simply fence and claim previously held common land on which the Werin-Bobble had had the right to graze their animals, cut turf, collect wood, rushes and furs for their basic needs. Cardiganshire was widely thought to have the poorest standard of housing in the whole of Wales. I'd like to read you a description now, dating from 1803. This is of a worker's hut near Stratflorida in the Plynlimon Range in Cardiganshire, and a visit to this hovel was described by the Reverend John Evans. It was partly formed by an excavation in the slate rock, and partly by walls of mud mixed with chopped rushes, covered with sedge, and having a wattled or basket-work chimney. The entrance was at the gable end, facing the south-east, which was defended during the night or in very cold weather by a wattle hurdle clothed with rushes. A wall of turf for fuel served as a partition for the bedroom, furnished with a bed of heath and dried rushes in one corner. The furniture was such as necessity dictated. Some loose stones formed the grate, 2 large ones with a plank across them supplied the place of chairs. A kettle with a black stone for baking oaten cakes answered every culinary purpose, and 2 coarse earthen pitchers stood by for the preserving or carrying water, and dod griavel, the usual beverage of the family. And dod griavel is quite common at this period, and it was a hawthorn berry seed drink, which doesn't sound very appetising. So even by 1803, it's common to find dwelling places like that in Ceredigion, and actually there are photographs of hovels like that. And if you think photography is not widely in use until 1880, 1890, so to have a photograph of a hovel like that and a poor person standing in front of her hovel is really quite shocking. Accusations that the gentry spent their money more on improving their various houses and landscaping their parks was borne out in the fact that mining methods in Cardiganshire were largely the same as they had been in Roman times. Except for the use of gunpowder underground and water to drive ore-crushing hammers at some of the bigger mines, work was done solely by hand. Women with bandaged hands splitting the ore with hammers, and children picking through the rubble to extract the nuggets of lead that were described as being like plums. Women also carried the ore in baskets on their heads, and the Cardiganshire roads were so bad that goods were mostly transported by pack horse or mule or even oxen train rather than by wheeled vehicles. To the mine owners belonged not only the mines themselves, but the dwellings of the miners, many of whom lived away from their families in barracks. The notorious truck system was in operation in many mines, whereby the mine sold equipment and provisions to their workers at an inflated price. Far in the hills there was no competition, and their monopoly over people's lives was complete. Further down the mountain, though land was more useful, tenancies were precarious and there was little incentive to improve your holding. The ruthless estate stewards were also election agents, and those tenants eligible to vote in elections often had to swear an oath of loyalty to their landlord upon signing the lease for their holding. Their vote was not private, and the threat of eviction for not supporting their landlord's interests was very real. Several of the big estates even operated a system of paid informers before elections. David Howell's book about the poor of Cardiganshire is fascinating in its study of this aspect of people's lives. The church was of little help. Just as the landlords were increasingly absent, so vicars, often only able to speak English, contracted out their duties to poorly paid curates. These men were known for drinking, gambling and cockfighting, even in the churchyards, and there is evidence of the church being dissolute and negligent in many parishes. Though many ordinary people made up the violent mobs that injured and in some cases even killed Methodists and dissenting preachers in this period, the New Zealand passion of charismatic figures such as Howell Harris and Daniel Rowland gave many poorer people a renewed hope. Some of the very poorest in society depended upon poor relief, wearing the pauper badge in red or blue cloth prominently on their sleeves. Again, the same figures that administered this relief were also the JPs, handing out the harsh sentences for vagrancy or bastard bearing, and having to contribute themselves to the poor rate, there was little incentive for them to be generous. Poorer women and children scoured the hillside, collecting discarded sheep's wool, caught on gorse or brambles, or they collected cockles and seaweed on the shore. The sentences for property theft were extremely harsh in this period. You could be transported or even hung for the theft of a sheep. Burned with a branding iron for petty theft, thrown in the stocks and pelted with missiles, even killed on occasion, and whipped publicly about the town for being homeless. But, though these people sometimes used to beg for eggs or pay their rent in butter, they were not always passive or compliant. Just as they had joined in mobs to chase away the Methodists and dissenting preachers at the behest of the gentry, who, in the words of Howell Harris himself, hunt us like partridges, so these people rioted against corn prices and duties and against intimidation of voters at elections, famously setting fire to Carmarthen town in 1755. Despite severe difficulties, freeholders sometimes banded together to pose a legal challenge to such injustices as the enclosure of common land, and then as now, no details supplied, there was a thriving black market economy operating under the radar of the taxing authorities in Cardiganshire. Smuggling was seen as a legitimate activity, and even wrecking was documented. Colliers and quarrymen formed temporary militias to terrorise magistrates or to collect debts for those able to employ them. Poaching was rife, as was vandalism of the walls and hedges used to cut off the people from their traditional rights to graze animals and collect fuel on the ancient commons. Squatters cost landlords fortunes and sleepless nights to evict. It was customary to build a dwelling on common land. If smoke was issuing from the chimney of the tea-in-norse by morning, then the builder would have the right both to the building itself and to a small patch of land surrounding it. Originally of mud, thatch and furs, many of these cottages have since been improved and are found throughout the Cambrian mountains even today. Though felons were sometimes injured whilst in the stocks or on the way to the scaffold, it was not unknown for mobs to rescue more popular prisoners from the stocks and the whipping posts, and even to saw down gibbets. Some parts of towns were no-go areas, and I want to leave you with an account of how women, made tough by their hard work in the mines, quarries and herring fisheries of the time, were able to terrorise the authorities. There is an account from 1730 by High Constable Edward Parry, who, after having arrested Phoebe Ledbetter on suspicion of felony, was forcefully robbed of his prisoner by a man he charged to help him, aided by a mob of angry women who surrounded him. And an even more interesting story of Moll Gorch, or Red Moll, the common whore of Llandaff, who was rescued by a mob of women after robbing a hapless client. So, many of these feisty, long-suffering individuals were our ancestors, and it's a constant source of awe to me that they survived at all. Even into the 20th century, my family was servants to the gentry, renting cottages from the great Gorgervan estate, working in the lead mine at Estradanion, and taking a day off school to remove their caps and open the gates for the famous Gorgervan hunts run by the Price family. The more I know about my ancestors' lives, the more I admire them for their sheer endurance and resilience. Owain Bobber Gumri, I salute you. So, thank you very much for listening to my lecture. And if you're passionate like me about Cardiganshire life or life in the Georgian period in Wales, there's so much to see in Ceredigion. Obviously, coming here and staying at this wonderful country house hotel would be a must in anybody's itinerary. Many of the rooms are as they would have been in the 18th century. And you can stay not only in the Mews house or the converted wash house or in the rooms back in the service wing that has been brought to a fantastic state by the current owner, but you can stay in the main house, in the main rooms on the first floor, where the power family of Nanteos would actually have stepped themselves. Just down the road at Llanbadarn is a wonderful medieval church of Llanbadarn Fawr, very important in the medieval period, and where lots of the characters in my two books about Nanteos and life in 18th century Cardiganshire are buried. Lewis Morris is buried there, many members of the family are buried there, and you can visit their tombs and read the tablets that tell visitors about their life. You can also go up into the mountains, and there's a lot left from the iron ore and lead ore industries up in the hills. You could go underground at the Wyrnog Museum and actually get a slight taste of the sort of life that miners would have had in the 19th century. All over the hills, Cambrian hills, there's the waste of the mines. There are pits covered over by grills to help stop people and sheep falling in. There are the remains of pools, there are the remains of adits, there are drains, there are caves everywhere. So it's fantastically atmospheric. Just take a walk, buy yourself a map and a picnic and go all day and just immerse yourself in the sort of ravages and the sort of lives that people would have led up in the hills. In terms of research, the fantastic National Library of Wales, as well as the Ceredigion Museum, can tell us so much. There are archives for all the major houses, including Nanteos, and you could read letters that were written by hand by the people who later became characters in my books. If you like to read, many writers have explored this region, explored this area in the 18th century. Not many fiction writers, but a lot of people looking to write documentary books. One particular interesting one that I've used a lot is The Rural Poor in 18th Century Wales by David W. Powell, a scholarly book. It's not an easy read, but it's fascinating. He also wrote a book called Patriarchs and Parasites, specifically about the Cardiganshire gentry. Some easy reading books, but again, very well researched, and I'm a huge admirer of all these writers. There's Peterwell, The History of a Mansion and its Infamous Squire by Bethan Phillips. There's the wonderful local historian Gerald Morgan edited a book on Nanteos, a Welsh house and its families. This is of course a classic that those of us who are interested in Nanteos can't do without. And there's a great new book by Janet Joel, who actually knew people who bought the Nanteos estate after the last Margaret Powell left here in the 1950s. And her family, Janet Joel's family, actually worked for the estate over many generations. So this is called Nanteos, Life in a Welsh Country Estate, and it's printed by Carreg Gwalch. So, diolch yn fawr iawn am gwrando ar y darlith. A bob hwyl, a bob lwc yn Naffo 2021, a gobeithio gewch chi llawer o sbort, llawer o hwyl yn fyw o'r hwyl. Diolch yn fawr iawn.